ora e te whānau, welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast on the biggest, or at least the most interesting, political issues. I am Newsroom political editor Laura Walters, and joining me in Wellington is senior political reporter Marc Daalder. Hey Marc.
Hello.
And joining us in Auckland is Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy. Hello Tim.
Hi guys.
So this week we are moving on from last week's one-year election anniversary special, and we're getting straight back into the guts of things. We're back in a sitting week in Parliament and it is all go. And I thought that potentially a good place for us to start, have a little bit of a chat, is around all of the polls. So politicians are back in Wellington and it's been polls galore the past week or so. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. Are politicians always, well, at least when they're bad, they write them off. They say we don't care about the polls. If they're good, of course they do care about them. Do we care at Newsroom in Raw Politics? Do we care about polls, Marc?
I think polls right before an election are when they're most useful, like watching the US election. That's when it matters. Here, they can be a catalyst for political change in terms of, if a party polls really poorly and then you have a spill and so on. Other than that, though, the issues that we're going to actually be talking about in the 2026 or early 2025 election are going to be very different from what's relevant today. The parties are going to be different, quite possibly many of the people are going to be different. And so is it relevant to what's going to happen in 2 years' time? Not really. Is it fun? Maybe. Sure. Yeah.
What do you think, Tim? I mean, is it worthwhile taking notice? There is only one poll that counts, right, as they always tell us?
Yeah, I love them, but I hate them when they deliver no change. And basically, One News this week, their poll had virtually no change, really. It was 1 point here and there, and it was so very sort of, things as they are. I think one interesting factor can be in the off years, the non-election years, is what issues are coming up. And I think the sort of movement of health it was the Courier poll, Taxpayers Union poll, as a concern up into second place after, the Dunedin Hospital and some of the health staffing and budget blowouts and all that sort of stuff, is indicative, I think, of just some sort of issues that people are taken by. So I think you can look at other things in them. I love them. I look forward to them greatly, but you got to admit when they're not really moving much.
Yeah, it makes sense for a political junkie like yourself, Tim. And I was interested in one of the questions this week out of the One News poll around whether or not the PM is out of touch. Of course, we've talked a lot about Christopher Luxon's personal issues, how he deals with them, how he communicates them, and I think it was just over half the country reckon he was out of touch. What do you reckon, Marc? Is he out of touch? Are we out of touch for talking about how much we think he might be out of touch?
I think everyone needs to get out of the beltway a bit more. But the interesting bit I found on that is, it's split along party lines, but for New Zealand First voters, 72% of whom agreed that Luxon was out of touch. And so, partly that's just a loyalty to their man, right? But does it speak to a lack of enthusiasm for Luxon that sits in the middle? Does New Zealand First really sit in the middle anyways? Lots of discussions that you can have out of that, but it was an interesting finding compared to ACT voters who did fall in line behind Luxon and saying, he's in touch.
And isn't it the case that if you asked anybody about a male, older business person, politician, if they're in touch or out of touch, that most people, any of us know, would say they're out of touch.
Hey, Tim, are you
taking away the Luxon name, but just, I think you'd say any person of that type, say, are they in touch? You go, oh, no, not really.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like you're calling the PM stale pale male, but that's all right. We'll move on.
Well, he's a fresh male.
Okay. That's their slogan for 2026.
Yeah, fresh pale male. You heard it here first.
And now, Marc, you mentioned New Zealand First. We will be talking about them a little bit later in this episode. What we have coming up for you is a little bit of a look back over the Crown's cover-up of state abuse for people who have been in state care, and where to now for the government and for those survivors. As mentioned, we'll be talking about New Zealand First off the back of their annual general meeting, and we will also be asking all the Nimbys out there what they think of the lengthy list of fast-track projects, and as always, to wrap up, we will offer you some recommendations. At the end of July, the Royal Commission on the Abuse in Care tabled its report. It was a groundbreaking report. We've talked about it before on the podcast. It was huge, and what it contained was incredibly significant. It detailed the horrific abuse and torture that survivors endured while in the state care system and in faith-based systems. We have covered this a lot, including on Raw Politics. Newsroom, of course, has had ongoing coverage of what abuse survivors have endured, and also the Crown's response before the Royal Commission, during, and since then. One of the big takeaways of the report was not just what people endured and those, harrowing details that were in the report, but also the Crown's response when survivors came forward with their stories. The report does detail the links that the Crown, that government agencies, that ministers and governments, successive governments went to minimise and to cover up this abuse, including the torture that happened at the Lake Alice Psychiatric Hospital. Now, this past week, Newsroom has run an in-depth series by Aaron Smale, which looks into exactly who knew what and when about this torture and this abuse, and the steps that they took, the very specific steps that they took to minimise and deny what happened. Now, Tim, you have waded through Aaron's 20,000 plus, I think, word series. That's not to make it sound heavy or dense, but just to explain the significance of it, the amount of research and detail and things that went into it. I'm interested in your personal reflections after reading through all of that. What's really struck you?
I think it's about 23,500 words, and it is dense, but it's densely good and densely formidable piece of journalism. The importance of what Aaron's done and what we've published, and the importance, I think, in general to the public and to the issue, is that it brings together elements of the Royal Commission's 16 volumes and multi-year, many thousands of pages of results, goes from that and then looks back and pieces together who, when, where, what. Not so much the abuse, as you said, Laura, not the events of torture, not the clinical or punishment or the social welfare homes, not those decades, but the decades since then, as these victims have been trying to fight for recognition, for truth, for justice, for compensation, whatever. And the tale it tells, and why it's political and why we're talking about it on Raw Politics, is that it goes through multiple administrations, health ministers, attorneys general, prime ministers, deputy prime ministers, ministers of justice and police, solicitors general, Crown law, all kinds of influential lawyers, judges, and so on, who had a exposure to it, a role in it, implicated in some clear ways in criticisms by the Royal Commission. So it's a very extensive, very important New Zealand story, New Zealand piece of history. They don't come actually much more important than this, with the thousands and thousands of people maltreated and then worked against by instruments of the state to stop the truth coming out and to stop any kind of justice or redress. Now, all these decades later, the first complaint was raised about Lake Alice in 1973, as Aaron points out. And here we are in 2024, 51 years later, getting an apology in a couple of weeks, formally in Parliament with victims there from the government. So it's a very important issue. Aaron's series does it extremely well. It's written in an accessible way that explains and does identify, as the Commission did, but puts names to some of these allegations in a way that really is very important.
And Tim, you're talking about why it's relevant now in terms of that apology that's coming up on the 12th of November, so less than a month away now, and how the government is trying to respond to the report, how they're trying to take steps to put things right, to look at redress, to look at compensation, to look at recognition and acknowledgement of what happened. And of course, they won't make everyone happy with what they do, but, now they're trying to take steps to, as much as they can, make right what has happened in the past. But what was really interesting, I thought, was how Aaron's series kicked off, and that was noting that Judith Collins, who is still in government, who is the current Attorney General and does have involvement in this redress and this government response to the Royal Commission's report, that in 2014 she sat in front of the UN and she denied that any torture had happened in New Zealand. So it's not just a historical thing. It's not just talking about government ministers and government departments and bureaucrats and judges that have done wrong in the past. There are still people who are part of the system, who have immense power in the system now, who have been part of that cover-up, that minimisation, that denial as well. And I think that, Judith Collins was away this week. She's in NATO. She hasn't been in the country to answer questions following Aaron's story and Newsroom's publication of that. But I think that we will be watching that incredibly closely when she does return.
This is what you guys have both been talking about, is around the past, I suppose, right? The findings of the commission. But what has happened since that report landed, and what are we expecting, as a result of it?
So I think we've mentioned this before on Raw Politics, that Erica Stanford is the minister responsible for the government's response. And she was alongside the Prime Minister. She fronted on July 24th and gave, the initial apology, the initial recognition. She talked about the report, reading that, the personal impact that has had on her. And then it was up to her to go away and start working on what does accountability look like? What does putting this right look like? What does justice, redress, compensation look like? And by all accounts, she's been working incredibly hard. And one of, I think, the most significant things to note is that she's been doing that with survivors, every step of the way. Like we mentioned, you're never going to make everyone happy, but it sounds like she's trying incredibly hard to take a trauma-informed approach to this, to take survivors along with her. She's meeting with them regularly. She's got survivors up in her office. They ring her up. Some of them have a direct line to her, especially those people who know this issue and have been advocates and have fought very complex legal battles as well. So they really understand the system and how it works. So that's kind of the first part of it, has been the listening. And then since then, one of the first steps that Erica took was to say that they're going to focus on Lake Alice survivors first. Of course, now the government has formally acknowledged that, some of the people who were at Lake Alice were tortured and that they should be given priority. Many of them are unwell. And a huge part of that is because of what they had physically and emotionally and mentally endured. So she's prioritising the Lake Alice victims and redress for them. She's also bolstered what was the Crown Response Unit, turned it into a Crown Response Office within the Public Service Commission. Rebecca Kitteridge, many people will know her name. She's been a senior public servant for a really long time. She's currently, a Deputy Public Service Commissioner, and she's at a very high level overseeing that work in the Public Service Commission. And then just this week, they've also announced the head of that Crown Response Unit, Rajesh Chana. And I think, of course, now it's important to mention that there have been criticisms about his appointment, and that just shows how complex and difficult this is. People that might be seen as having expertise because they've worked in the public service in the space of human rights, in the space of torture, and interacted with these cases, so have knowledge of it and of those complexities. Many of them are also seen by survivors for varying reasons and for varying things they've done as either complicit in the cover-up or have, overtly been involved in that. And you'll see that there's a Newsroom report on his appointment as well and the criticism around that. So that's all to say that the government is moving forwards with this. It's incredibly complex. It is a huge piece of work. Erica Stanford is trying to do what she can. She's dragging this public service with these, entrenched culture along with her as fast as she can. And there will be problems and roadblocks and stumbling blocks along the way. And then we'll see what else happens, I guess, between now and November 12th with that apology. I think one of the questions I'm most interested in is around compensation and what that looks like. And Marc, I know that you've looked at this a little bit as well. I mean, the Royal Commission reports estimates that compensation for survivors could look, and their families, I guess, could look up like something up to $217 billion, which is a huge amount of money. I mean, what do you think about that? Can the government conceivably ever afford that, or how would they tackle that kind of level of compensation?
Yeah, it's worth noting there are some recommendations in the redress report that was released by the Royal Commission, but there's historical precedents for thinking about these sorts of things as well, right? And you have some questions to ask yourself, and the government has some questions to ask itself, and some conversations to have with survivors about what is the purpose of this compensation. People look at things like reparations for slavery, which hasn't happened in the United States, right? But there's an active discussion about that, and part of the purpose of that is that the average Black family in the United States with the same household income as a white family, living in the same place with the same number of children and so on and so forth, has half the wealth of that average white family. And that's just a generational effect of slavery. And so reparations in that case partly is to try and correct that, right? To say some people have had an advantage due to the human rights abuses, and some people have been historically disadvantaged by that. That's partly how this kind of many billions number has been come up with is understanding what is the impact on these people's lives and their economic productivity and their families and their children and so on and so forth. So is the goal to try and correct for that, real economic effect? Is it to acknowledge and apologize and to offer something more than just token, I suppose, sympathy in words, but acknowledge also that actually reaching that quantum is never going to be fully feasible. You see this with Holocaust reparations, right? None of the amount that was distributed, A, equaled what was taken from Jews and other people who suffered in the Holocaust, but B, could never, make whole the communities that were destroyed by it. And so that type of reparation was much more focused on, this is a symbol of our regret and our apology and our acknowledgement that we did something wrong, rather than an attempt to say, hey, let's fix it, which is a difficult discussion. And in terms of the quantum, $217 billion, it's just, for any government, not going to be super feasible. We've been hearing, we'll talk about the $100 billion future fund from New Zealand First. This is 2.17 of those, and even that seems like very much a stretch. And
it is interesting as well how the mood has shifted. This when the day that the Royal Commission report was tabled and the government response, came out, the Prime Minister stood in the House and Erica Stanford stood up in the House as well, and they offered these unreserved apologies, and survivors felt incredibly hopeful and, rightfully so with how the government responded to it. But since then, there has been criticism about the culture that has continued within the public service, whether, court cases that have continued to block fair compensation, a lack of action generally, a feeling like maybe it's not going to be enough, whether it's money, whether it's apology, whether it's true acknowledgement or change of culture, not just for themselves and their families, but for the next generation as well, for young people who are currently in the state's care. And so there has been a mood shift. So now, it's really on the government to step up and to offer something meaningful and significant on the 12th of November, but in the years to come as well.
Two quick things to finish up on this. One is that number is a thing we'll never see. We know that. That's not going to happen. Whether dollars and money actually is the goal is also not something that I think is clear. Probably justice is the goal of these victims. And if they can't have justice still, then I think truth, the fact that it's come out and been known, A, what happened, and then B, who and how the Crown tried to squash them, is very important to them. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, we're raw politics, talking politics here. What a hell of a job Erica Stamford has been given. You know, you're looking around the cabinet room and everyone points to you and says, well, you can take this one on, Erica. That is an enormous, generationally politically challenging role. If she can pull it off to any degree of success, that will be an amazing achievement.
And I mean, as well, Erica Stamford, I can't imagine trying to do that work, but then also when you're potentially coming up against, say, Judith Collins, you know, who is already on the record as denying that that torture had happened. You know, when you've got these two senior, strong cabinet ministers who might have differences of opinion there, it makes it politically difficult within the party as well. This past weekend, New Zealand First met in Hamilton to hold their annual party convention. There were the usual things. There was Winston Peters' speech where he pitched New Zealand First as a scrappy underdog. He took some jabs at the media, as he is wont to do. And there were speeches and comments about immigration, race, gender, and of course the woke elite. Everything that you could hope for from a New Zealand First AGM. I guess it's kind of, you know, get your bingo cards ready and you probably filled them all out. There were also some interesting policies, though, that came out of it, including a remit. But before I go on, I also just want to acknowledge New Zealand First. While they might take jabs at the media constantly, they are also incredibly open with their party conferences. They allow media in for speeches, for remit discussions. That's something we don't see from most of the other political parties. So you do get real insight into what the membership genuinely wants and thinks. And one of the things to come out of that remit session was a new policy, a promise for a $100 billion New Zealand future fund, so $100 billion to fund infrastructure going forwards in New Zealand. And there was also a lot of discussion about the importance of overseas investment and the part that that's going to play in continuing to boost and fuel our economic recovery going forwards, which I think was interesting to hear from New Zealand First, right, Tim? I mean, you know, you've been following this party for a while now. What do you think of, you know, the New Zealand First of 2024, how they pitched themselves this weekend compared to, you know, what they were 31 years ago?
You can't say that New Zealand First is sort of static and just the same as it ever was. It's changed quite substantially, actually, not just in its representation now, but you know, it in the 90s was strongly challenging of international immigration, investment, foreign buy-ups, purchasing. It was a very nationalist party. It was a strongly Māori party back then, and it introduced and won so many of the Māori seats then. It's changed, it's transformed. We don't hear much. I mean, there was a bit, yes, about immigration, but, you know, when immigration was at its peak, huge numbers, 130,000, I think, was the net figure for 1 month's year prior. You know, people migrating to New Zealand. That would have had them in spasms 20 or 30 years ago, and it just didn't. And you don't hear so much about the oldies as much as you used to. You know, they were the party of the super gold card and all these sort of rights and standing up for people on retirement income and so on. Still are, but you just don't hear that focus so much. The other thing that's interesting is they really are positioning someone else as a sort of second tier leader in Shane Jones. And it's more and more evident, even to the point, yes, at the conference, he was speaking and holding forth on a very political, wide-ranging role, as he does. But in the House as well, he's plainly, when Peters is not there, he's the one making points of order along the lines that they like to follow. And I noticed there was even a meeting the foreign minister, New Zealand First leader, Winston Peters, had with the Japanese ambassador this week, in which he invited Shane Jones there as well. Now, Jones has portfolios that might intersect with that, it's fine, but it was presented with sort of the three of them in a diplomatic kind of photograph. Shane's standing there with his chest puffed out, looking very proud to be a representative and a sort of a New Zealand kind of figure. So it is changing. And look, they are remarkable. They've come back twice out of nowhere. So you've got to give them that. Whether they can stop going out into the wilderness for the third time is a big ask in the next year, if you believe Marc's prediction of when the election's going to be, or two.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well, right, that Winston Peters says, he's 79 years old now, but he's convinced that he's coming back next time around. But it almost feels like if he decides not to, that Shane will be there ready, waiting in the wings, prepped and primed and good to go. I mean, what do you think, Marc? How is Winston and New Zealand First balancing this? Tim's just talking about ministerial meetings, being a minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, with also, being a party leader, the leader of New Zealand First. It's a small party, as you say. They've been kicked out of Parliament before, or that they've failed to come back after being in coalition or in government. How is he balancing those two roles and managing to differentiate himself as a political party leader while still doing his duty as a minister?
Is he trying to balance his role as a party leader and as a minister? Are we hearing things significantly different coming out of his mouth than if he wasn't constrained by the cabinet manual and the tight yoke of Christopher Luxon's premiership? I think, we've discussed this before, right? Probably as we get closer to the election, he'll be more willing to explicitly criticize Acton National and their policies, and maybe even things the government is doing, than he is now. But it's not like he's really tightly restrained at the moment. So I don't think this is a particularly difficult balancing act for him. I think he's happy to coast along, making his remarks, including ones that are inconvenient for the government or for his partner parties. Things like even this $100 billion fund, which he says, look, I'm going to be taking this kind of round two of coalition negotiations a year after the election, is we've got a new policy and we'd like to implement it now as well. And, perfectly within his right to do that. Maybe there are a couple of things where he would go harder on them were we 6 months out from an election rather than 12 maybe or 24. But I don't think it's a particularly difficult act for him. I think he's done this also enough times that it's easy for him to slip into the, year one, this is what I do, year two, this is what I do, and then the final year. Yes, it does look marginally different, but it's not the same as maybe how other parties have felt constrained in the past by coalitions.
And it might feel like a long time ago now, but just, the election campaign was just a year ago, and it feels to me like the Winston Peters that we heard on the campaign trail was different to the Winston Peters that we hear day to day. In terms of the issues, I guess some of the issues are more what we would describe as fringe issues that he pushed quite hard. Now, is that him balancing those things, or is it him just identifying a different voter base? I mean, there have been suggestions that he is, in terms of, say, we need to do race relations differently in New Zealand. Well, ACT's got that covered. I'm not going to bother going after that. So maybe I turn to Labour and say, well, the disaffected working class, you can come over to New Zealand First. It's not a majority view within the unions, but there have been people within the unions who have come out and actually supported New Zealand First. So, and he spent a lot of his speech this past weekend having a go at Labour, a lot of his speech, and that makes you wonder whether maybe he's just shifting his focus and trying to get a different voter base rather than trying to tone himself down.
Yeah, I think it's reading the political winds rather than in ahead of the election we'll be going back to the conspiracy theory things. I think he's just finding the constituencies that can cobble together 5%.
And you can teach an old dog new tricks. Look, he's foreign minister again, and he's being exposed to some international thinking, some policies. He's always had a grab bag of countries that he said New Zealand should be like, and that's sort of Singapore and Ireland, and used to sort of mix and match the Scandinavian countries. I think Iceland's been thrown in there now, hasn't it? He always goes on about these people and their way of doing things. So you go to these countries, you're exposed to these people, you kind of maybe think, look at the kinds of funds that these countries have. I think the $100 billion fund is just a made-up sort of stunt, really. It's a number that we all know. We need hundreds of billions of dollars done in infrastructure, so just put a number on it and put it out there. put a decade on it in the future and no one really notices if you don't achieve it. But, I think maybe he is being persuaded a bit by what he's seeing and hearing from people a bit more exposed to the world than he's been.
Our audience question for this week is, will the fast track list see a NIMBY backlash? It sounds great when you read it out like that. What do you reckon, Mark? 149 fast track projects that have been identified as part of the government's fast track bill. Are people going to like to see these big projects springing up in their backyard?
Yeah, I think it is a case-by-case basis, but the sheer number of them means people are, you're gonna piss someone off, right? It's just compared to Labour's COVID fast-track bill, there were 17 projects listed in that bill. Worth noting that just because a project is listed doesn't mean it will be approved. There's a whole process to go through, but that process is clearly going to be qualitatively different from Labour's process because we actually see a couple of projects on this list that failed in their bids to go through the Labour fast-track scheme. So they clearly think, hey, it's easier to get this consented, which is another reason people might feel uncomfortable. NIMBY in the big sense, right? Not just housing developments, but you've got mines or solar farms, right? Several solar farms have been listed here in places where their neighbors are extremely not keen for them to be built. And so, you've even got a national MP, Greg Fleming, who's opposed to a rail line going through his electorate, which that rail line is now in the fast track. So what's it going to do?
In Onehunga in Auckland. I mean, you're our Auckland representative, Tim. What do you reckon? Are people going to actually lie on the tracks like Greg Fleming says he would if people put train lines or massive housing developments in their backyards?
No, because Aucklanders don't believe any of these kinds of projects, fast or slow, ever get done anyway. So you can, it's a thing, again, we'll never see the 149 of them. We might not see 100 of them, really. Might not see 49 of them. Or we might over, 50 years when they get progressively done. But, I think unless you're living on dock land or in some pristine area of coastline, you don't have to worry.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations. Your favourite thing that you have read, watched or listened to this week. Tim, let's start with you.
No contest for me this week. It is Aaron Smale's formidable series on Newsroom about the Crown cover-up over abuse and care. Yeah,
fair enough. Mark, what is your recommendation for us?
I've got kind of two recommendations. I've got a gold prize, gold medal, and then silver medal on the same topic about misinformation after the hurricanes in the U.S. and ahead of the U.S. election. One by Charlie Warzel in The Atlantic, which just tries to describe how bad the kind of information ecosystem has got in the United States, and then something of a complementary piece to that about the Hurricane Helene misinformation by David Wallace-Wells in the New York Times.
Thank you. And mine for this week is from the Spin-Off. Madeline Chapman had a fantastic piece on the controversial appointments of the new Human Rights Commission chiefs and the fact that they were not the top picks by the independent panel, that they were kind of inserted or chosen by ministers and government. Well worth a read there. That is us from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you so much to our producer, Trent Doyle, and to all of our listeners, readers, and viewers. If you have any burning thoughts or just, any reckons you want to share with us, send them my way. My email is laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us here next week on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.